please help me in welcoming Ashton Applewhite.
Wow. Feels like Las Vegas. Yeah, well, I know it's nice to see so many familiar faces. I know many of you are familiar with my previous talk, so I thought I would work up something completely new. So thanks for having me here. We'll start with the familiar idea that there's one thing that everyone in this room is going to become. That would be older. And most people in the US and around the world are scared stiff at the prospect. I think a lot of people in this room are a little more enlightened, but still, there's lots to worry about. I used to feel pretty scared and uneasy when I saw that word. And what was my darkest fear? Ending up drooling in some grim institutional hallway. And then I learned that the percentage of Americans over 65 in nursing homes is 2.5%. Since I started talking about this, since the last time you might have heard me, it's diminished from 4% to 2.5%. Yep. And it continues to drop. Even for people 85 and up, the number is only 9%. 8 out of 9 brains, 90% can think just fine to the end. Alzheimer's is a terrible disease, but it is not typical of aging. And even as the population ages, dementia rates are falling significantly. Sometimes I feel like that's sort of my job, is not to say that the scary stuff isn't real, but that we don't ever hear both sides of the story. Hardly anyone knows that about dementia rates. The total number of cases in the population is growing because there's more older people, but the odds of any one of us in this room being diagnosed with dementia have dropped significantly, and people are getting diagnosed at later and later ages. So the real epidemic, I would say, is anxiety over memory loss. And what was another ageist assumption I started out with? Well, I figured that old people were depressed because they were old and they were going to die soon. And it turns out that the longer people live, the less they fear dying, and that people are happiest at the beginnings and the ends of their lives. It's called the U-curve of happiness, and it has been borne out by dozens of studies in the US and around the world. I mean, I was so skeptical when I started out. I figured that could only be a function of like cornering two 80-year-olds and giving them a cookie. And it's true everywhere in the world. So skeptically, gears grinding, my point of view began to change because I realized that getting older was certainly going to be different and probably way better than the grim slide into dementia, depression, and puffy white shoes of my nightmares, only you already saw this slide. But seriously, that's scary. Are you with me? And that's before I started to have to see a podiatrist, so the joke is on me. Not funny. So I started feeling better, and I started obsessing about why so few people know these things. And the reason, you know what this slide is going to say, is because of ageism. Judging a person or a group of people based on how old we think they are. We experience it any time someone thinks we're too old for something, instead of finding out who we are and what we're capable of, or too young. It's really important to remind people that ageism cuts both ways, and young people experience a lot of it. All prejudice, ageism, sexism, racism, they're all socially constructed ideas, which as fancy sociologists speak for, we make them up. And they change over time, and they serve a social and economic purpose. Prejudice is not about how we look. It's about how people in power assign meaning to how we look. Stereotyping underlies all prejudice, the assumption that members of a group are alike. And of course, stereotypes are always a mistake, but especially when it comes to age, because the longer we live, the more different from one another we become. And yet we still tend to think of people in a retirement home as the same age. That would be old when they can span 4 decades. Can you imagine thinking that way about a group of people between age 10 and age 50 who are in fact developmentally far more homogeneous? Pitting young against old, like pitting groups of low-wage workers against each other, or the interests of stay-at-home moms against moms in the paid workforce, is a time-honored tactic used to divide people who might otherwise join forces to challenge the status quo and work towards better conditions for everybody. This us or them logic always pops up around health care rationing. Listen for it. Why should we spend money on older people when we could spend it on kids? This is not ethical. It is no longer legal to allocate resources by race or by sex, and weighing the needs of the young against the old is equally unacceptable, period. So the next time you encounter that line of thinking, cut it off. Point that out. Old versus young thinking also fails the common sense test. Communities that are good to grow old in, that have parks and good social services and public transportation, are good for everyone. They're all age-friendly. So that's another thing I'd love to do, is if you've encountered the age-friendly cities or age-friendly terminology, see if you can get people to change it to all age-friendly, right? So that it's not framed as, why are we spending money on old people, right? It's better for all of us. Nobody's born ageist, but it starts in early childhood, around the same time that attitudes towards race and gender start to form, because negative messages about late life come at us from the media and popular culture at every turn, starting with cartoons and children's books. Wrinkles are ugly. Old people are sad. It's depressing to be old. Older people can be the most ageist of all because we've had a lifetime of absorbing these messages and we've never thought to challenge them. Like everyone else, I internalized these ideas, and I had to acknowledge it and stop colluding. Senior moment quips, for example, I stopped making them when it dawned on me finally that when I lost the car keys in high school, right, kids forget stuff all the time too, I didn't call it a junior moment. Like I stopped blaming my sore knee on being 65 because my other knee feels fine and it's just as old. Do you ever grouse about entitled millennials? When you get to a party, do you head for people your own age? Ever reject an outfit or a relationship or a haircut because it's not age appropriate? For adults, there's no such thing. All these behaviors are ageist. We all do them. And we can't challenge bias unless we're aware of it, right? So the first step is to look at your own attitudes and think about where they come from. Confronting unconscious bias is uncomfortable, and it doesn't come naturally. You can tie a baby elephant up with a rope, and it soon learns it can't get away. And the same rope will do the job when the elephant is the size of a Volkswagen, and the rope pulls tighter over time. As age-related stereotypes grow more relevant, we tend to act as though they're accurate, and that creates self-fulfilling prophecies. Unless we challenge the underlying message that to age is to lose value as a human being. It's that basic. It becomes part of our identity. That's internalized ageism. And it is why, like the elephant, we collude in our own disempowerment and stay tethered. I had to acknowledge and start letting go of the prejudices about aging that had been drummed into me since childhood. And what was the hardest prejudice to let go of? I bet some of you can answer this. The one against myself, my future older self. All prejudice relies on othering, right? Thinking of another group as other than us, a group of people, whether it's other sports team, other color, other religion, other nationality. The strange thing about ageism is that other is us. Ageism feeds on denial, our reluctance to acknowledge that we're going to get old, that we are aging, that we might even be old. It is denial when we refer to older people as them instead of us, even after we've rounded the third turn on the track. It's denial when we believe in anti-aging products or get offended when someone politely offers us a seat on the bus. It's denial when we feel like our bodies are betraying us simply because they are changing. Age denial blinds us to our own bias and perpetuates it in 1,000 ways. It is not having a vagina that makes life harder for women. It's sexism. It's not loving a man that makes life harder for gay guys. It's homophobia. And it is not the passage of time that makes getting older so much harder than it has to be. It is ageism. When labels are hard to read, or there's no handrail, or we can't open the damn jar, we tend to blame ourselves, our failure to age successfully. instead of blaming the ageism that makes these natural transitions shameful and the discrimination that makes these barriers acceptable. When we dye our hair just to cover the gray, or conceal our age, or leave early accomplishments off our resumes, we reinforce age shame. These are really successful strategies, and I completely understand why so many people engage in them. No judgment, I swear. But they're like a gay person trying to pass for straight, or a person of color trying to pass for white. They're not good for us because they're rooted in shame about something that shouldn't be shameful. And they give a pass to the underlying discrimination that makes these behaviors necessary. It drives me nuts when some clown calls me young lady and expects me to feel complimented, but I didn't know why until I started thinking deeply about it. Because it's embarrassing to be called out as older until we quit being embarrassed about it. Why on earth do we stop celebrating the ability to adapt and grow as we move through life? Why should aging well mean struggling to move and act like younger versions of ourselves? Everyone wakes up a day older, and the sooner we accept that, move from denial to acceptance, and maybe even all the way to embrace, the better off we'll be. That's when we overthrow what Bill Thomas, geriatrician Bill Thomas, and I know he has a lot of fans in this audience, including me, what he calls the tyranny of still, the delusion that as long as we're still working or still dating or still running up the stairs, still driving at night, we all have our stills, it's just human, that we could stop the clock, as if that would be a good thing. Aging is not a problem to be fixed or a disease to be cured. It is a powerful, natural, lifelong process that unites us all, which is another reason if you think that it's a little crazy to pit old against young. You can't make money off satisfaction, but shame and fear create markets, and capitalism always needs new markets. Who says wrinkles are ugly? The multi-billion-dollar skincare industry. Who says perimenopause and low T and mild cognitive impairment are medical conditions? The billion-dollar pharmaceutical industry. What a market if the right pills and potions can cure it, because we're all going to come down with it. The more clearly we see these forces at work, the easier it is to envision alternative, more positive, and more accurate narratives. And the longer we wait to take that step, the more damage it does to ourselves and to our place in the world. More and more older people like me are expanding the definition of working age, whatever that means, right? Just like retirement. I mean, there's a word that we have no idea what it means anymore. Both because we want to and because we have to. The combination of longer lives and the economic downturn of 2008 and the demise of traditional pensions means that many people in their 60s and 70s have way too little in savings to retire comfortably. And I don't know why I stop at 70s, obviously all the way out. Many are slipping into poverty for the first time. Maybe you've heard about the older nomads, not quite homeless, who drive from one low-wage job to another in secondhand RVs. Heard about that? Yet age discrimination in the workplace is rampant. The personal and economic consequences are devastating. Engineers in Silicon Valley are getting Botoxed and hair plugged before key interviews. And these are skilled white men in their 30s. So imagine the effects further down the food chain. Right? The article that sort of blew this up a couple of years ago, the whole thing about ageism in tech, was in Technology Review, and it quoted a guy who was getting some kind of skin treatment, and he had a really important interview, and he said, "I can't look like I have a wife and 2 little kids." Now, there's something wrong with the society where that disqualifies you for paid work. An information society demands the deep knowledge base of older workers. Experience is an asset, not a liability. I mean, blindingly obvious. Not one negative stereotype about older workers is true. And we know that diverse workplaces aren't just better places to work, they work better. And just like race and gender, age is a criterion for diversity. Ask people to name their criteria. People usually leave age off just because it hasn't bleeped onto their radar yet and point it out. And I will tell you, no one says, that's a dumb idea, or let me get back to you on that one. Push back against age discrimination, and workers of all ages benefit. Older workers need flexibility and accessibility, but the same modifications help students and people with disabilities and caregivers and anyone trying to make a living in this heartless gig economy. Ageism in medicine means less treatment, worse treatment, sometimes no treatment at all. If your doctor says, at your age, what do you expect? Time to find a new doctor. We now understand that much change that was thought to be irreversible and biologically based has much more to do with how people perceive their futures, which is, of course, the important work that Masterpiece is engaged in. Yet physicians and their patients write off old age ailments all the time. Doctors tend to spend more time with younger patients and ask them more questions, even though their conditions are less serious. Why should we accept a different standard of care for older patients? That's institutional ageism at work. Internalized ageism matters too, a lot. A growing body of fascinating research shows that attitudes towards aging have a measurable physical effect on how our minds and bodies function at the cellular level. People with more positive feelings towards aging walk faster, heal quicker, and live longer. A whopping 7.5 years longer, which the original study, Jack Rowe's study, unearthed some of these findings for the first time. Age denial, on the other hand, keeps many people from making the lifestyle choices that would pay off in the long run. That's why the World Health Organization is developing a global anti-ageism campaign to extend not just lifespan, but health span. Study after study shows that attitudes towards aging matter a lot. People who associate old age with growth and purpose are less likely to develop dementia. This is a new study, it just came out last month. Even if they have the gene, that APOE gene, even if they are genetically predisposed to the disease. So, which really, scientists are very skeptical to put things, unequivocally, but that really means less ageism, less dementia. It's that simple. These positive beliefs, the thinking goes, help keep us healthy by buffering stress and prejudice, the effects of ageism. Equating aging with disease and decrepitude, on the other hand, makes us more vulnerable to exactly that. We also know that some people whose brains were full of Alzheimer's-type plaques and tangles stayed sharp as tacks. What did they have in common? A sense of purpose. And what's the biggest obstacle to having a sense of purpose in late life? A culture that tells us that getting older means shuffling off stage. Ageism again. Women face the double whammy of ageism and sexism, so we experience aging differently. Women are less likely to be able to afford a decent retirement because we earn less than men, we're penalized for time spent out of the workforce, typically spent on unpaid caregiving, and we live longer. There's a double standard at work here, shocker. The notion that aging enhances men and devalues women. Women reinforce this double standard when we compete to stay young. Another punishing and losing proposition. Does anyone in this room really believe that she is a lesser version, less interesting, less fun in bed, less valuable than the person she used to be? If so, think about where those messages come from and what purpose they serve. When we rank the other women in a room by age, we reinforce ageism, sexism, looksism, the idea that the most important thing about you is your appearance, and patriarchy. You don't need a PhD in women's studies to know this is not good for us. It's expensive, it sets us up to fail, and again, it pits women against one another. This discrimination, the crippling intersection of sexism and ageism, affects our health, our income, and our well-being. The effects add up over time and are further compounded by race and by class, which is why everywhere in the world, the poorest of the poor are old women of color. Quote, ageism allows the younger generation to see older people as different than themselves. Thus, they subtly cease to identify with their elders as human beings, unquote, wrote Dr. Robert Butler, who coined the word ageism in 1969. There's that othering thing again. And when we see people as other, their well-being seems less of a human right. That's one reason 5 out of 6 incidents of elder abuse go unreported, and I've seen much higher numbers. Unlike domestic violence or child abuse, we don't talk about elder abuse much, and neither do many victims who are embarrassed by their vulnerability, ashamed to ask for help, and think they may not deserve it. That's internalized ageism at work, reinforcing structural discrimination. Most of us hope to have some control over how and when we die. The best way to achieve that is to discuss our hopes and fears ahead of time, ideally well ahead of time, and ideally on an ongoing basis. Because we don't know what we're going to want at the end till we get there. Age denial, pretending we're not getting older, not to mention never going to die, makes those conversations a lot less likely. And it also leads us to squander resources on costly but ineffective tests and treatments, especially towards the end. The flip side of this coin is that an ageist society casts the end-of-life problem in terms of growing numbers of old people who inconveniently refuse to die, when the underlying issue is the changing nature of healthcare. It has become commonplace to hear even healthy, middle-aged people wondering whether the ethical alternative to living too long will be to commit suicide. Not because they're sick, or ran out of money, or have no one to take care of them, just because they got old. That is internalized ageism of the deadliest sort. At any age and in any condition, a person has the right to want to stay alive. Feeling alienated from older people is not natural or inevitable, and neither is feeling apprehensive at becoming like us. These feelings are the result of social forces: ageism, sexism, and capitalism. Age segregation impoverishes us all because it cuts us off from most of humanity, especially in the United States, where it's really rare for someone to have a close personal friend who is more than 10 years older or younger than them, and 10 years isn't that much. Discrimination sanctions segregation and isolation, which, as I'm sure you all know, is the biggest threat to a good old age. Exchanging skills and stories across generations is the natural order of things. An intergenerational world is straight up a better world. For those of us with access to healthcare and education, for the first time in human history, 4 living generations are becoming commonplace. We're going to have more time to figure out what we want to do with our lives, and more time to accomplish it and share what we know, and more time to wind down with the people we love. To take advantage of this longevity dividend, we need to quit the reflexive hand-wringing, challenge the ageist assumptions that underlie it, and think realistically and imaginatively about how to shape the multi-generational society we all hope to live long enough to inhabit. It's going to take all hands on deck and all ages. What's the takeaway from that map? Our world is growing older fast. By 2050, 1 in 5 people worldwide, almost 2 billion people, will be age 60 or up. Longer lives are a fundamental hallmark of human progress. All these older people represent a vast, unprecedented, and untapped resource. And yet, shamefully, in a historic reversal, the lifespans of the least educated Americans are actually contracting. Capitalism and urbanization have propelled age bias into every corner of the globe, from Switzerland, where olders fare the best, to Afghanistan, which sits at the bottom of the Global Age Watch Index. Over half of the world's 195 countries had to be left off that list because we don't bother to collect data on millions and millions of people simply because they are no longer young. Almost 2/3 of people over 60 around the world find it hard to get health care. Almost 3/4 say their income does not cover basic necessities like water, electricity, food, and decent housing. Is this the world we want our children, many of whom will live to be 100, to inherit? Until we dismantle ageism, it will pit the generations against each other. It will rob society of this incredible accrual of knowledge and experience, and it will poison our futures by framing longer lives as problems instead of the remarkable achievement and opportunity they also represent. The social capital of millions more healthy, well-educated adults than ever before in human history. This longevity is new. The institutions around us were created when lives were shorter, right? It's not all ageism. Roles and institutions have yet to evolve, and this gives us a critical window of opportunity to shape a world that supports people at all ages, at every point in our lifespan. So, how do we get there? Growing older isn't just different from what we've been brainwashed to believe, it is way better. It is not that the losses aren't real, but that we only hear one side of the story. Aging brings authenticity, confidence, perspective, self-awareness. And my mother said her legs got better, and I'm really looking forward to that part too. priorities are clearer. It's easier to manage emotions. We care less about what people think, which is really liberating, especially for women, I think. We want less. That's why I've never met anyone who actually wants to go back to their youth. No swapping out just the battered bits. Because our years are what make us us. Entire industries are built on convincing younger people that my 65-year-old body is hideous, that old equals ugly, especially for women. A system designed to exploit our insecurities can only do it with our consent. Instead of muttering, "What the hell happened?" at the face in the mirror, how about taking a minute to think about some of the things that did happen and how extraordinary they were? My hands now recall my mother's on the steering wheel of her Bel Air Chevy station wagon carting the kids around. What's wrong with my knobby white knuckles? Absolutely nothing. Listen to ad man Chuck Nyron on older women's bodies, which offer, quote, "contours aplenty, shapes galore, curves, mounds, crannies." Afterwards, you think about what you didn't get to yet, unquote. Why does that seem so damn radical? Why didn't we think of that? Let's not delude ourselves. This is the work of a lifetime. We need to embark on it with others and across generations. Make friends with younger women. Younger women make friends with older women. None of this stigma is natural, none of it is fixed, and change is underway. In August, Allure magazine banned the term anti-aging from its pages, commending instead, quote, "the long-awaited, utterly necessary celebration of growing into your own skin, wrinkles and all," unquote. The next sentence did link to a plug for Retin-A, but it's progress, seriously. If this mainstay of the beauty industry can do it, so can we. Insist on being seen and valued as our full, rich, lumpy, complicated selves and take that change out into the world. 13 years ago, when I moved to a Brooklyn neighborhood with a median age of about 23, really, I said that it would be time to move when I could no longer hustle up the subway steps as fast as the kids. Now I ask the hipsters to help me with my bags, and it's good for both of us. At first, I had to force myself, because in this culture we think that asking signals weakness or failure. But these are two-way transactions. People like to help. Guys hoist my suitcase like it's a lunchbox and reward me with a big smile. The terms and power dynamics are going to shift. The goal is to give and receive with grace. I've got time to practice. The key, it seems to me, is to embrace the idea that dependence is no more shameful at the end of life than at the beginning. Autonomy requires collaborators. No one is truly independent ever. We are social creatures. All of life is interdependence. Let's acknowledge the need for helping hands and reach for them gratefully and without shame. The most important component of a happy old age isn't how healthy you are, how wealthy you are. It is having a robust social network. Our networks do tend to shrink over time because we leave the workplace typically, friends we've known all our lives die, and family, and that is why it is essential to make friends of all ages and hang on to them. If you don't know people much older or younger than you, seek them out. Think of something you like to do. Going to a concert or playing poker or knitting. Guys knit these days. And find a mixed age group to do it with. Don't stay home just because you'll stick out. That's how desegregation happens. People with the most at stake, olders in this case, step up and step out. We stop conforming. The open-minded welcome us, and incremental social change takes place. Youngers benefit too. Otherwise, each generation has to figure out on its own how dumb and destructive it is to fear aging, and how much of our youth we squander on worrying about it. Dismantling ageism will require nothing less than a mass movement, like the 20th century movement that catalyzed a mass shift of consciousness for women around the world. Women came together, shared their stories, and realized that what they'd been thinking of as personal problems, like not getting heard or getting hired, were actually widely shared political problems that required collective action. There's a term for that shift in awareness: cognitive liberation, which I love because it speaks to the geeky in me and the activist in me. As we become aware of discrimination, first we have to see it, right? And then realize it's not okay, right? That we don't have to accept second-class status, as just the way it is. And then realize that we can come together and do something about it. Cognitive liberation is a fantastic feeling, and it is the linchpin of movement building. Changing the culture is a tall order, but culture is fluid. Look at the momentum Me Too movement has achieved and how much progress we've made on gay and trans rights in just a few decades, even a few years. Look at gender, which we used to think of as a rigid binary, male or female, and now we understand to be a spectrum. It is high time to ditch the old-young binary too. There is no line in the sand, no crossover between old and young after which it's all downhill. And that imaginary threshold segregates us and fills us with needless dread. Everyone, all races, all genders, all nationalities is old or future old. Until we put a stop to it, ageism will oppress us all. That makes it a perfect target for collective advocacy and a unifying cause. Why add another ism to the list when so many, racism in particular, call out for action in these grim times? Here's the thing, we don't have to choose. When we make the world a better place to grow old in, we make it a better place in which to be from somewhere else, to have a disability, to be queer or non-white or non-rich. And when we show up at all ages, for whatever cause we believe in, save the whales, save the clinic, save the democracy, we not only make that effort more effective, we dismantle ageism organically in the process. Longevity is here to stay. A movement to end ageism is underway. I'm in it. And I hope you will join me. Thank you.